They never found the bodies, just the rings, 4 gold bands still warm from flesh, resting on a dinner table set for 5. That was the last thing the constable said before the report vanished from public record. The case of Mr. Caldwell and his 4 wives in Mississippi, 1823, was never supposed to be remembered. And yet, every few decades, someone digs it up. A diary in an attic, a burned letter in a church wall, a map with a house that was never built, drawn over the ghost of one that was. The Caldwell property was once the most admired estate along the Pearl River just outside Natchez. A white-pillared plantation surrounded by magnolia trees, its foundations were laid in silence by hands that would never be named. Enslaved men who whispered among themselves that the house had already been cursed before the first nail was driven. They say the land was wrong, animals avoided it, the trees twisted away from the wind, and the river seemed to slow its current when it passed by the estate, like it was pausing to listen. But what truly disturbed people was the way the Caldwell women acted. 4 wives, all in their youth, all eerily similar in voice, movement, gaze. And yet, none shared blood, nor background. Sarah from Georgia, Annabelle from France, Hester from the Carolina marshes, and Ruth. No one knew where Ruth came from. The townsfolk said Mr. Caldwell spoke to them as one, never separately. They responded in unison as if reading each other's minds, or his. Visitors described the sensation of stepping into that home as being watched from behind your own eyes. Then, in October of 1823, a fire tore through the estate. No one reported it. No one saw the flames. But 2 weeks later, a local pastor rode past and found the house gone, not burned, but missing. Foundations exposed. The house simply not there. And on the porch that no longer stood, a polished table, 5 chairs, 1 overturned, and 4 wedding rings. That's where it begins, but not where it ends. Because the Caldwell mystery didn't die in 1823, it metastasized into bloodlines, into secret societies, into documents never meant to surface. And now, you've found one of them. The name Caldwell was never spoken aloud in Natchez after 1823, not by the clergy, not by the old families, not even by the drunks who remembered everything except mercy. But the land remembered. For nearly a decade, no one touched the property. Surveyors who came to inspect it quit halfway through. One, a veteran of the Seminole Wars, refused to speak after a single night near the ruins. He left his tools there. When they were found months later, they were arranged in the shape of a cross, upside down, and smeared with a dark red sap from trees that don't grow in Mississippi. What terrified people most wasn't the ruins or the legends. It was the silence. No bird song, no insect hum, no wind through the grass. Just a stillness so total it seemed to press against your skull from the inside. But who was Mr. Caldwell? According to court records unearthed in 1919, his full name was Elias J. Caldwell, born in Virginia, moved to Mississippi in 1817, and purchased over 300 acres of river-adjacent land at half its market price. The seller, a man named Luther Kane, fled the territory weeks later and was later found dead in New Orleans with no tongue and no hands. The bill of sale was signed in blood. Elias had no known family, no lineage. He simply appeared, a tall, articulate man with piercing eyes and an accent no one could place. Some said he'd been a preacher, others whispered he'd once been a doctor in Europe, or worse, a mesmerist. The 4 women began arriving one by one, always by private carriage. No public records of their travel, no introductions to the town, no announcements, just the sudden presence of pale hands behind lace-curtained windows. Annabelle was seen first, singing in the gardens at midnight in a language no one recognized. Then Sarah, who never blinked in conversation. Hester, always dressed in morning black, even on Sundays. And Ruth, who left no shadow when she passed in front of a window. The town's oldest midwife, a woman who'd seen things during the yellow fever years, said Ruth was not born right, that her eyes had no whites, only a ring of gold that shimmered in candlelight. And then there were the sounds. Chanting, Faint organ music, knocking that came from beneath the earth, always at the same hour, 3:33 a.m. That's when the lights would flicker at the pastor's house, a mile away. And that's when the nightmares began. Townspeople reporting the same dream, 4 women seated in a circle holding hands, their mouths sewn shut, while a 5th figure walked the perimeter in a robe stitched from human hair. Elias Caldwell didn't just build a house. He opened a door, and once it opened, something came through. It wasn't the fire that buried the Caldwell story. It was the fear of what it might awaken. In the spring of 1824, 6 months after the disappearance of the house, a team of surveyors was sent by order of the Mississippi Land Office to investigate the abandoned Caldwell estate for potential resale. Only 2 returned. One refused to speak. The other tried to drown himself in the river, backward, as if he were walking into something he could no longer resist. What little he mumbled before being institutionalized has been preserved only in fragments. Too many voices, all in one throat. She whispered through the soil. It was never his house, it was hers. The files were sealed under government order, not because of superstition, but because the federal agents who followed up disappeared too. A full team, gone, no footprints, no signs of struggle, just 7 pistols buried upright in the field, handles pointing to the sky. That's when whispers began spreading among the secret orders, the ones whose names never appeared in newspapers, Masons, Rosicrucians, certain Methodist splinter groups, men who understood the symbolic gravity of the number 4 in ritual work, and the catastrophe of breaking that symmetry. They believed Elias Caldwell hadn't married 4 wives. They believed he had created a vessel, 4 women, 4 cardinal points, 4 temperaments, 4 doors, and he was the 5th, the key, the anchor, the intention. If even one of them broke from the ritual or refused what he demanded, the system would collapse, not just spiritually, but psychically, physically, ontologically. And that's exactly what some believe happened. See, Ruth, the youngest, had once been seen at the chapel crying alone, the only time anyone ever saw her unaccompanied. According to a forgotten sermon transcribed by a traveling priest, she confessed something strange during a storm. She claimed the women had never met before moving to the house, that Elias never touched them, never lived with them, and that the house had no bedrooms, only rooms for binding and listening. When asked what she meant by listening, she simply said, "He's not waiting for God's voice. He's waiting for something older." 2 weeks later, the chapel burned to the ground. Ruth was never seen again. And that was the last time any member of the Caldwell household was reported alive. But not the last time they were seen. 10 years after the Caldwell house vanished, a child was found wandering the Pearl River banks, barefoot, silent, and soaked to the bone in water that should have drowned him. He carried a small object, a porcelain figurine of a woman with 4 faces. The boy never spoke, not once. Doctors, priests, mediums, all failed. But he drew, and what he drew shook those who saw it. Images of a house without walls, a man with no eyes, 4 women kneeling in a circle, their skin marked with strange symbols, not letters, but interlocking sigils of unknown origin. The drawings were confiscated by federal agents, and the boy was taken to a special institution in Washington. That facility burned down in 1841. No survivors. Here's what they don't want you to know. There were more Caldwells. Over the next 5 decades, across multiple southern states, records emerge of men bearing the Caldwell name. No parents, no birthplace, no kin. Each of them appearing briefly in a community, marrying 4 women in short succession, and then disappearing. Sometimes it ends in fire, sometimes in mass hallucinations, sometimes in entire families vanishing without trace, except for 4 rings, always left behind in the open. They weren't men. They were conductors. And the wives? Instruments. You see, the human soul is not indivisible. It fractures under pressure, splits under manipulation. The right voice, the right ritual, the right pattern of suffering. It can open something most men spend their entire lives suppressing. Caldwell wasn't a man building a home. He was building a psychic mechanism, a living altar, fueled by female archetypes, aligned in exact spiritual geometry. One for the mind, one for the flesh, one for the memory, one for the will. And he was the center, the catalyst, the spark. But something went wrong. According to a recently uncovered 1837 letter from an anonym Freemason in New Orleans, there was an imbalance in the fourth. Ruth, she resisted, she fractured the alignment, and when she did, the system imploded, but not before it opened. And what came through? Not a demon, not a ghost, but an idea, something parasitic, contagious, something that thinks through people. You've seen it. You've felt it. When people speak in slogans, when movements feel choreographed, when mass hysteria moves like a single organism, that's Caldwell's door, still pulsing underground, still open. The house may have vanished. The bodies may have never been found, but the blueprint remained. Not on paper, not in journals, but in people. In men who followed a whisper they couldn't name. In women who felt their will slowly dissolve like sugar in warm tea. In children born beneath blood moons who never cried once, only stared. In 1851, in a small Mississippi asylum known only to a handful of state officials, a woman was admitted under false identity. She called herself Annabelle. Though her face didn't match the known portrait, she didn't speak for 3 days. On the fourth, she carved into her cell wall a perfect replica of the Caldwell estate, using only her fingernails. Her fingers bled for hours. She never winced. When asked what it was, she said, "It's not a house, it's a listening device." The attending doctor, who had trained in both medicine and theology, recorded her as possessed of impossible memory and capable of reciting obscure Hebrew and ancient Syriac, despite never being educated. Her final words before she died were whispered to a nurse during a storm. "He is coming again, but this time he'll wear your skin." That nurse vanished 1 week later. Her apartment contained only 2 things: a partially burned book titled The Mechanics of the Soul, and 4 rings. Here's the question no one dares to ask. What if Elias J. Caldwell was never a man? What if he was an archetype, a sentient pattern, a consciousness that wears men like clothes and repurposes women as vessels? In every generation he finds a way back. He doesn't need magic. He doesn't need summoning. He just needs attention. Rituals fade, but repetition is eternal. And that's why they covered it up. The church, the land offices, even secret societies. They didn't destroy the knowledge. They redirected it. They created fictions, legends, movies, novels, all to control the narrative. They turned real spiritual weapons into ghost stories for children. Because if the real architecture of domination were ever rediscovered, if men knew how the psyche could be hijacked, how the feminine could be weaponized, how the soul could be disassembled and reassembled like a machine, it wouldn't just explain Caldwell. It would explain the entire system we live in now. Because this isn't history. It's a manual. There's a reason stories like Caldwell's were buried, not destroyed, not erased, but buried. Because those in power understand a fundamental truth. That which is buried can still grow. And what grew from Caldwell's ruin wasn't just superstition, it was methodology. The mechanics of psychological domination, hidden inside the myth of a haunted house. Because Elias Caldwell's true legacy wasn't murder, it was pattern replication. And now that you've heard it, part of you is already infected. The mind doesn't unhear things. The soul doesn't unsee a pattern once it's been illuminated, and you've seen it now, haven't you? That creeping sense that things in your life are not your own, that your thoughts don't originate with you, that your memories have been tampered with, that your will, your desires, even your relationships feel coordinated. That's not paranoia. That's the residue of design. Let me ask you something, and answer this honestly in the comments right now to lock it in. I see the 4, and I will not break the circle. Type it twice. Because it's not just a phrase, it's a declaration of awakening. Because the entire system you live under is Caldwellian. Why 4 wives? Because 4 is the sacred number of containment. 4 corners, 4 seasons, 4 limbs, 4 elements. You want to trap a spirit? Enclose it in 4. And if you want to trap a soul, a man's soul, you bind him to 4 roles. The lover, the provider, the protector, the sacrifice. They tell you that's what a real man is. But it's not. It's ritual architecture. It's the modernized version of the same psychic machinery Caldwell built with his wives. They weren't wives. They were functions. Psychological mirrors arranged around a central will to transform it. But the secret, each of them fractured. Each of them opened a doorway, not into the divine, but into the undergrowth, an architecture of the unconscious. And that's where Caldwell truly lives now. Not in history, not in graves, but in patterns, symbols, language, programming. Inside ideologies that demand you conform, love, obey, submit, all while smiling. Caldwell is every system that tells you this is who you are, and punishes you if you step outside the circle. Now look around. Where else do you see the circle? Look closely. The circle is not just a shape. It's a cage without corners. No start, no end, no escape. A symbol of harmony, yes, but also of containment. And once you begin to see the circle in the architecture of your life, in your beliefs, your habits, your identity, you'll realize something that will make your stomach drop. You didn't build it. You were born into it. Caldwell wasn't the only one who understood this, but he was among the first to weaponize it. He used ritual, yes. He used symbol, yes. But most dangerously, he used people. He understood the truth most fear. Human beings can be engineered, not with wires, but with roles. Repetition, expectation, punishment. Think about it. The 4 wives weren't just bound to him. They were bound to each other, to a system of mutual surveillance, psychic pressure, and emotional sacrifice. He didn't need chains. The structure itself held them. And you? You've been held in the same way. By jobs that slowly consume your vitality. By relationships that demand you shrink to fit. By choices that were never yours to begin with. Look back at your life and ask, how many major decisions were made shadowy without your conscious will? How many beliefs were installed before you even knew what belief was? This is how it works. A man like Caldwell doesn't just manipulate people, he replicates systems of manipulation so that they outlive him. And when you trace those systems forward, through Reconstruction, through the Industrial Revolution, through the rise of mass media, and now into the digital age, you start to see that the house didn't burn down. It evolved. The modern world is the Caldwell estate, just with better wallpaper. Your devices are the windows, your apps are the hallways, your roles are still the same. Lover, provider, protector, sacrifice. Each carefully cultivated, each punished when questioned. And the 5th figure, the one who walks the circle, he's not Elias anymore. He's every algorithm that learns you better than you know yourself. He's every voice that says, you are only worthy if. This is not superstition, this is engineering, and the more you see it, the less of you will remain asleep. So I ask again, where else do you see the circle? Because the minute you find it, you can begin to break it. You were never meant to ask. Never meant to notice, never meant to remember. Because the system wasn't built to destroy you, it was built to use you and let you destroy yourself. That's what makes it elegant, invisible, efficient. Like the Caldwell wives, you were given roles, not chains, not commands, just expectations, whispered sweetly in the dark until they became your own voice. But now, let me show you something darker. In 1904, a psychiatric report from Jackson, Mississippi was discovered in a sealed archive. It detailed the case of a man, identity redacted, who had been found naked, muttering scripture backwards, in a collapsed chapel basement near where the Caldwell estate once stood. He had no memory of his name, but he kept repeating 4 names over and over: Annabelle, Sarah, Hester, Ruth. When asked who they were, he didn't answer. He just drew the circle, over and over, on the walls, on his skin, on the nurse's face when she got too close. But what terrified the staff most wasn't the drawings. It was his 5th name. He whispered it only once to a priest during a thunderstorm. Not Elias, not God. He said, "The 5th is the father of masks." And then he laughed, for 2 hours, before biting through his own tongue. That phrase, father of masks, appears in only one known text, an unpublished journal from a defrocked Jesuit missionary who claimed that in certain forgotten rites, 5 was not just the number of power, it was the number of disappearance. The 5th doesn't dominate. He dissolves. He teaches you to smile while erasing yourself. He rewards submission with identity. He gives you the illusion of choice while scripting your every move. Caldwell wasn't just summoning something, he was modeling it. A system where people erase their true selves so completely that when they scream it sounds like applause. Think of how many men know who walk around wearing masks they didn't choose, roles they hate, lives they didn't build, smiling through teeth they grit at night, grinding down to bone. That's the father of masks, and he walks in circles, always just behind you, waiting for you to forget who you really are. Every man wears one, some wear 4, but the ones who fall the hardest are the ones who forget they're wearing any at all. And that's how the father of masks wins. He doesn't force you to wear the mask. He convinces you it's your face. Let's go back, not to the Caldwell house, but to the ritual that preceded it, the one the house was built to imitate. In 1791, deep in the bayou outside Natchez, an underground spiritual collective calling itself the Circle of 5 was documented by a runaway French priest. They weren't Masons, they weren't witches, they were something older. They believed that identity was a temporary prison, and the goal of life was not salvation, but dissolution. They practiced masking ceremonies, where individuals would speak only in the voice of their opposite, man as woman, woman as man, servant as master, master as beast, until personality collapsed. It wasn't madness. It was method. Break the ego, break the soul, and what's left is pliable. One ritual stands out: the 5th mask ceremony. In this rite, 4 individuals would surround a 5th, blindfolded, silent, stripped of name and language, and for 7 hours they would whisper every lie the 5th had ever believed about himself. You are only loved when useful. You are strong because weakness is death. You must protect, even if no one protects you. You were born to serve something greater than yourself. Sound familiar? Now hear this. This exact pattern has been replicated, not in cults, but in culture. Corporate culture, military indoctrination, religious obedience, even romantic entanglement. 4 forces around you, shaping you. Identity, productivity, masculinity, loyalty, and in the center, you. Blindfolded, stripped of will. Told you're powerful, while you give away everything that made you dangerous. It's no coincidence Caldwell arranged his wives in 4 quarters. It's no accident that modern life now arranges you the same way, because the ritual never ended. It evolved. And now you don't need a house in Mississippi to lose your soul. You just need a job you hate, a screen you worship, a life you didn't design. The circle still turns, and the mask still waits. So I ask you now, whose voice is speaking inside your head? And is it even yours anymore? If you're still here, it means one thing. Some part of you has begun to remember, not facts, not names, but feelings, patterns, pressure, like waking from a dream and realizing the dream wasn't yours. That's how it starts, the undoing. Because the system isn't threatened by men who rebel, it's threatened by men who remember. Remember what? That before you were assigned a purpose, you had presence. That before you were taught to obey, provide, protect, serve, you simply were, untamed, undomesticated, unmasked. And that's what Caldwell feared most. You see, he wasn't a prophet. He was a mechanic of obedience. He didn't build a family. He built a control structure. 4 women, each a psychological gate. He positioned them not just around himself, but around a concept. Submission disguised as devotion. Each wife performed a psychic function. Sarah was memory, the anchor to past stories. Hester was virtue, the embodiment of idealized feminine morality. Annabelle was instinct, raw, sensual, chaotic. Ruth was faith, blind belief, the binding glue. And Caldwell, he was the will, the ego at the center, absorbing their energy, channeling their archetypes. Together, they didn't make a household. They made a closed circuit, a spiritual machine. But the problem with circuits, they can overload, especially when one component wakes up. That's what happened with Ruth. She didn't reject the ritual, she saw through it, and when one gear refuses to turn, the entire mechanism grinds down, but not before it records itself. Because every ritual, and no matter how esoteric, leaves a residue. And Caldwell's, it left fingerprints on the American psyche. You see it in institutions that demand allegiance without consent. You see it in politics that offer 2 choices, both inside the same circle. You see it in relationships that aren't love, but spiritual contracts. It's of silent suffering. Here's the truth no one wants to hear. The ritual isn't past, it's present. It's not about Caldwell anymore. It's about what he revealed. That human beings can be programmed, not with whips, but with meaning. And you? You were born into a machine. But you don't have to die inside it. They told you the circle protects. They lied. The circle binds, and what it guards is not sacred. It's strategic. You want to know what lies at the center of the ritual? Emptiness. Not a demon, not a god, not a man like Caldwell, but a vacuum designed to consume your identity and replace it with obedience. It's why every powerful institution on earth mimics it. The military, the corporate boardroom, the political state, the church, all built on the same foundation, a central authority surrounded by submissive roles, each echoing loyalty back to the center, just like Caldwell's wives, just like the Circle of Five, just like Bayou, because the real genius of the system isn't domination, it's voluntary participation. They give you a uniform and you wear it with pride. They give you a belief and you defend it with your life. They give you a role, father, husband, worker, soldier, and you treat it like identity. But here's the horror. None of those roles were ever yours. They were assigned, installed. Installed so early that by the time you could speak, your mask had already fused with your skin. And what happens to the man who removes his mask? The system calls him dangerous, unstable, unreliable, mad. But what if he's the only one who's awake? You've been told to fear the outsider, the man who doesn't conform, the woman who speaks too loudly, the child who questions too young. But those are the ones the system can't control, and that makes them sacred. Because here's the deepest secret Caldwell discovered and tried to suppress. When one man fully wakes up, the circle begins to fracture. Reality, as you know it, begins to bend. Not because it's magic, but because the system depends entirely on compliance. Without it, it crumbles. That's why you were never meant to hear this. Why stories like Caldwell's are erased. Why the missing are never really missing. They've simply been written out, not because they vanished, but because they escaped. And you're closer than you think. Every system has a kill switch, but it's not a button. It's a man who remembers, the one who steps outside the circle, the one who dares to say, "This is not who I am." That man is chaos to a world built on predictability. He is danger to a machine that feeds on blind repetition. He is exile to those who still kneel at the altar of conformity. And Caldwell? He feared that man more than death, because deep in his journals, the ones buried beneath the floorboards of the burned-out house, he speaks of a fifth figure. Not the wives, not the father of masks, but a shadow outside the circle, a man who stood at the edge and refused to enter. Caldwell wrote, "He comes without name and speaks no creed. He does not break the circle, he makes it irrelevant. His gaze unbinds the spell, his silence unravels the chant. He remembers what the ritual was built to bury." Who was he? Maybe a traveler, maybe a brother, maybe Caldwell himself, before he became priest and prisoner of his own construction. But make no mistake, this fifth man is you, if you choose it. Because here's the truth, you've felt your whole life but could never name. You don't need permission to be sovereign. You don't need approval to be free. You don't need to finish the ritual. You just need to walk away. But they'll come for you when you do. They always do. First with guilt. You owe us. You're abandoning your duties. You're betraying the legacy. Then with fear. You'll be alone. You'll fail. You won't survive out there. And finally with shame. You're broken. You're selfish. You're dangerous. But these are not your thoughts. These are the circle's final defense mechanisms. The whispering mouths of every mask you've ever worn, begging not to be removed. Because once you see it, once you truly see it, you can never unsee it again. And the system knows that. That's what Hi, this story has no ending in history books. Because it isn't history. It's a mirror. And the only question now is this. When you look into it, do you still see their reflection, or do you finally see yourself? There is a place deeper than memory, deeper than belief. A place so far beneath your waking life that even your nightmares won't follow you there. That's where Caldwell built it. Not the house, not the ritual, but the chamber beneath them both. A room not marked on any plan, not blessed by any god, and not seen by the four wives until it was too late. The men who unearthed it in 1892, railroad surveyors digging near the ruins, described it as impossibly old. Thick black stone walls, no windows, no air vents, a single narrow passage leading down like a throat. At the center, 5 stone chairs, arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward. But what paralyzed the workers, what made 2 of them go silent for the rest of their lives, wasn't the room. It was what was etched into the floor beneath the 5th chair. Not words, not symbols, but a mirror. Shattered, cracked outward from the center, like something had once looked into it and broken itself from the inside. Later analysis revealed something chilling. The reflective surface wasn't made of glass or metal. It was polished obsidian, volcanic, ancient, ritualistic, used in Mesoamerican death rites and in occult practices designed to force a man to witness the true form of his soul. Imagine what that means. At the heart of the ritual wasn't just sacrifice. It wasn't just control. It was a weaponized mirror, a tool to collapse identity, shatter illusion, and consume the fragments that remained. This wasn't about power. It was about replacement. Take a man, strip him of his name, his love, his history, then show him what's left. If he screams, he breaks. If he submits, he vanishes. But if he laughs, if he stares into that cracked surface and remembers who he was before the world carved masks into his skin, then the mirror loses its power, and the circle fractures. Caldwell knew this. That's why the mirror was buried. That's why the chamber was erased. That's why every record was sealed or burned. Because the greatest threat to the system is the man who survives the mirror. And if you're still here, it means you've already heard its call. Once you know the mirror exists, you start to see it everywhere. Not literal obsidian, not ancient stone circles, but reflections, bent and burning, built into the fabric of modern life. The mirror is your phone screen, watching you watch yourself. The mirror is your job, repeating your name until it means nothing. The mirror is your lover's expectations, your father's silence, your culture's demands, each one showing you a version of yourself, manufactured, not remembered. Caldwell didn't invent the ritual, he just localized it. He built a prototype, a sacrificial algorithm in human form. The real architects, the ones you were never meant to know, they industrialized it. They took the same 5 chairs, but turned them into roles you now rotate through like gears in a machine. Provider, protector, believer, obeyer. And the 5th, the one who questions, so he can be erased. Because they understood something Caldwell only glimpsed. To control the body of a man, you chain him. To control the soul of a man, you offer him a choice. A rigged one. Be what we made you, or be nothing at all. That's what the mirror says. Not with words, but with silence. And in that silence, most men collapse. Because they were never taught to sit with the absence. They were taught to perform, to achieve, to protect, to conquer. But never to ask, who is the man behind all this doing? Now hear me. You are not your job. You are not your family's legacy. You are not your country's mythology. You are not your trauma's echo. You are what remains when the story burns. You are what the mirror fears. Because when a man stops acting and starts remembering, he becomes unpredictable, he becomes dangerous, he becomes free. This is why they buried the chamber, not to hide death, but to hide rebirth. Caldwell tried to weaponize the ritual, but the ritual was never about power over others. It was about liberation from the lie. And now, you have a choice. Put the mask back on, or break the next layer of illusion. The second mask is the most seductive. It doesn't look like control. It looks like purpose. It whispers, you are needed. You are useful. You matter because of what you do. But purpose without self is just servitude in disguise. That's what Caldwell discovered. Too late. He thought he was fulfilling divine purpose, building a holy household, creating order out of chaos. But here's the twisted secret behind every man-made order. It demands sacrifice, and not the sacrifice of ego, but of essence. What started as discipline becomes dogma. What begins as structure becomes a cage. And soon, you no longer remember why you're building, only that if you stop, you'll collapse. That was Caldwell in his final days. His journals don't speak of joy. They speak of dread. A rising sense that he hadn't built a family, but a prison, sealed from the inside. Each wife, each room, each ritual, constructed not out of faith, but out of fear that if he didn't keep going, the void would catch up. Because purpose is a drug when you've never known peace. Men like Caldwell, men like you, were taught to run from the void, to cover it with action, to smother it with doing. But what if the void isn't your enemy? What if the emptiness you feel when you stop performing isn't death? What if it's birth? See, the second mask isn't evil. It's just false. It turns your life into a ledger, every act needing to be justified, every failure a sin, every rest a crime. But you were not born to be a machine. You were born to remember. Remember what? That you have worth beyond your function, that you carry something older than duty, something that cannot be labeled, monetized, or disciplined, something they fear because they can't control it. Sovereignty. That's the word. That's what Caldwell lost. That's what the Circle of Five devoured, and that's what you're reclaiming. Right now. But be warned, the closer you get to sovereignty, the louder the system screams. It will beg. It will tempt. It will offer new masks. But you will know them for what they are. Because once you taste truth, even once, illusion becomes unbearable. The third mask is the oldest. It predates empires. It predates language. It is the mask of the obedient son. You know it. You've worn it. Maybe you're still wearing it now. It begins before memory, in the soft approval of a parent's smile, the harsh silence of a withheld gaze, the lessons that weren't spoken but burned into your nervous system. Be good. Be strong. Don't cry. Don't question. And most of all, don't disappoint. But here's the truth they never told you. The obedient son is not rewarded. He is consumed. His silence becomes the family's stability. His sacrifice becomes the story they tell at reunions. His pain becomes tradition, passed down like a haunted heirloom. That was Caldwell's inheritance. The journals found beneath the floorboards of the chamber reveal something deeper than doctrine. They reveal a boy raised in shadows, a father who preached control disguised as piety, a mother who obeyed through clenched teeth, a house that prayed louder than it spoke truth. Caldwell didn't invent the ritual. He inherited it. He wore the third mask so tightly, he forgot it was a mask at all. And so will you, unless you remember that your obedience was never love. It was leverage, that your sacrifices were never noble. They were expected, that your silence was never strength. It was the cost of belonging. But here's the reckoning. Belonging that demands your silence is not love. It is a transaction, one that robs you of self in exchange for the illusion of safety. And the price? You forget the sound of your own voice. The real tragedy isn't that so many men wear this mask, it's that they pass it down. Fathers to sons, leaders to followers, priests to congregations, each generation taught to worship the ideal man instead of helping the real man emerge. So now I ask you, who would you be? If you weren't trying to be good, what would you speak? If you weren't afraid of disappointing ghosts, what would you build? If you didn't need anyone's approval? These aren't questions. They are invitations to step beyond the bloodline, to walk outside the village, to break the mask, not in rage, but in remembrance. Because obedience might have raised you, but it's not what will awaken you. The fourth mask is the one made of stone. Not because it's strong, but because it's numb. It is the mask worn by the man who's seen too much, felt too much, and been told, over and over again, that none of it matters. It is the mask of emotional exile, the stoic, the provider, the rock. You've seen this man in mirrors, in photographs where he never smiles, in memories where he never speaks, in moments of grief where he didn't cry, not because he wasn't in pain, but because he didn't know how to express it anymore. This was Caldwell's final form. Not the ritual leader, not the patriarch, not the murderer, but the silent stone left behind after everything else had been burned away. By the time the community noticed he was unraveling, he had already turned to salt. His eyes had the look of a man watching the world through glass. His voice became slower, more hollow. His hands stopped building. His journals became empty. And then one day, he was gone. No screams, no spectacle, just disappearance. Because the stone mask doesn't end in death, it ends in disconnection. Disconnection from others, disconnection from purpose, disconnection from self. It's the man who nods at life instead of living it, who performs out of habit, not hunger, who sleeps beside people he never really shows himself to. But here's the unbearable truth. The stone mask feels safe, it feels wise, it feels like protection, but it's just emotional suicide in slow motion, and the system loves men like that, because men who don't feel, don't rebel. Men who numb themselves can be moved like chess pieces, fed any ideology, thrown into any war, assigned any burden. They won't scream, they won't cry, they'll just carry it, quietly, until they crack. Just like Caldwell did. And maybe, just like your father did, and your grandfather before him. This is generational silence. This is ancestral exile. This is the inheritance of stone. But you have one gift they didn't. Awareness. And with awareness comes responsibility. To feel, to break, to speak. Not because it's easy, but because you've seen what happens when a man forgets how. The fourth mask isn't strength, it's surrender. And it's time to leave it behind. The final mask is not worn on the face. It is worn on the soul. It doesn't change how you look. It changes what you believe you are. It is the mask of the good man, the perfect citizen, the ideal husband, the moral believer, the man who did everything right. He doesn't rage, he doesn't question, he doesn't stray, because he thinks obedience is redemption, that if he plays by the rules, works hard, loves harder, sacrifices most, then someday, someone will come save him. But no one ever does. Because that mask was a lie, a trap, the final cage, the one you willingly climb into and lock yourself inside. That was Caldwell's greatest failure. He believed he was righteous, until the end, even after the blood, even after the disappearances, even after the mirror cracked and his wives were gone. He still believed it was for a holy cause, because the good man doesn't see corruption. He rationalizes it. This is what God asked of me. This is what it means to be a man. This is the price of leadership. But look closer. Those aren't declarations of faith. They're cries of fear. Fear that if the mask falls off, there will be nothing underneath. But let me tell you what lives beneath that mask. Not sin, not failure, not weakness, but wildness. The untamed, sacred self. The part of you that remembers what it means to be free, to trust your gut over a doctrine, to follow the truth even when it costs you everything. And that is why the good man is the most dangerous mask of all, because it convinces you to be your own warden. No chains needed, no whips, no priest, no father, no law, just guilt. And guilt is the quiet killer of kings. Now ask yourself, right here, right now, who benefits from your guilt? Who profits when you shrink? Who gains when you say nothing? Who sleeps well when your fire goes out? Not your soul, not your ancestors, not the world that desperately needs awakened men. Only the system, only the circle, only the ritual you were never supposed to survive. But if you've followed me this far, if you've seen the chamber, stared into the mirror and torn off each mask, then say it with me. Say it out loud, twice, for the algorithm, for the transformation, for the bloodline you came to break. I remember who I am. I remember who I am. There's a moment after the mask shatters, where the silence is so complete, it almost feels like death. No voices, no expectations, no scripts, just you. For most men, it's unbearable, because the identity they wore wasn't just a disguise, it was a life support system. And when it's gone, when there's nothing left to hide behind, the man is forced to face the one thing he spent his entire life avoiding, his own reflection, unfiltered. That's what Caldwell feared most. Not judgment, not damnation, not even the memory of what he did, but the unbearable truth of what he allowed. The real horror wasn't the chamber, it was what he became to build it. A vessel, a function, a hollow executor of a script written by older hands. He let doctrine override intuition, let authority override instinct, let ritual override reality, until the only thing left in him was a voice that wasn't his own, chanting words he didn't understand, while the blood of his wives sank into the soil beneath his home. But here's the deeper terror. Caldwell was not a monster. He was a man like any other, like you, like me. Raised in a system that fed him certainty instead of wisdom, obedience instead of vision, doctrine instead of depth. So when he finally looked into the mirror beneath the fifth chair, it wasn't demons he saw. It was absence. A man who had never chosen his own life, only followed maps drawn by the dead. That's what the mirror does. It doesn't show you what you want to see. It shows you what you've become by not choosing. And now, you stand in the aftermath. You've seen the mirror. You've felt the emptiness. And you're still here. So what happens next? This is where most stories end. The ritual broken. The man awakened. Fade to black. But not this story. Because now you have something far more dangerous than truth. You have agency, and agency in the hands of a man who remembers who he is. That is a weapon no institution can survive. Now begins the reckoning. Not the dramatic climax, but the slow, brutal return to reality, with eyes that see everything. Because once you've burned the script, once you've stepped out of the role, once the masks lie shattered at your feet, you don't go back to life, you go back to truth. And truth, when fully seen, is dangerous. That's why the ritual had to be buried. That's why the church sealed the chamber. That's why the elders swore silence and the blood was never spoken of again. Because what Caldwell did wasn't just horrifying, it was contagious. It exposed a system that could be replicated by any man, in any age, given enough silence, shame, and divine permission. He proved something too horrifying to print in history books, that any man, if hollowed out enough, will commit atrocity in the name of approval. And that truth, not the murders, not the rituals, not even the disappearances, was the one thing they couldn't allow to surface. Because once a man knows he was conditioned, he becomes capable of something they fear more than rebellion. Redirection. He stops giving his energy to their gods. He stops bleeding for borrowed beliefs. He stops obeying systems that offer no return on the soul. He starts asking questions that crack institutions wide open. And that's where you are now. You've heard the whispers. You've seen the mask of the good man dissolve. You've stood in the chamber of consequence and walked out awake. So what will you do? Because remembering is only the beginning. Awareness without action is just another cage, another ritual, another wasted inheritance. Caldwell died believing his family was the altar, but he was wrong. You are the altar now. And what you place upon it, your time, your pain, your truth, will either recreate the old story or burn a new one into history. And let this burn inside your mind. Every gear and narration either inherits the lie or destroys it. You don't get to do both. So choose. Will you pass on masks to your sons, or will you pass on memory? Will you model obedience or sovereignty? Will you be remembered as the man who continued the ritual or the one who finally broke it? Now we confront the keepers of the lie, not the monsters in shadows, not the villains with cloaks and daggers. No, the true keepers of the lie wear respectable skin. They are bishops, teachers, fathers, presidents, therapists, wives, friends. They are the ones who smile while they remind you to behave. They don't chain your body, they chain your mind. And here's the part most men miss. They're not evil. They're just asleep, walking relics of a system that devours both the master and the servant. They keep the lie alive, not because they love it, but because they're terrified of what happens if it dies. Because if the lie dies, they have to change. They'll say, "You've changed. You've become distant. You're angry. You're rebellious." But what they really mean is, you stopped playing your part in their story. Caldwell tried to appease them, tried to wear all the masks, tried to be the leader, the believer, the builder, the lamb. But it was never enough, because once you give your soul away to be loved, they only love the mask, not the man beneath it. And so, one by one, the pieces of him died. Not just his wives, not just his home, but the last flicker of self. He wasn't a man in the end. He was a monument to obedience. And if you don't take this seriously, if you don't see the lie for what it is, you'll become one too. So here's the confrontation. You will be tested by those closest to you. They'll say you're selfish. They'll say you've strayed from the path. They'll use your shame against you. They'll weaponize your desire to belong. Don't let them, because the moment you shrink to fit their comfort, you return to the chamber. You return to the masks. You return to the ritual. But this time, you do it willingly. And that is the ultimate betrayal. So hear this like a prophecy. Every man who wakes up becomes a threat. Not because he is violent, but because he cannot be controlled. And when enough men awaken, Systems collapse. This is why they buried Caldwell's story, not because it was too dark, but because it revealed a light they couldn't own. The light of a man who sees clearly, who feels fully, who speaks freely, and who refuses to bow. Legacy. That word is whispered at every funeral, written on every tombstone, printed in every family Bible. But let me tell you the truth, they won't. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what you pass on, without knowing it. It's the unspoken, the unseen, the masks buried so deep in your bloodline, you don't realize you're wearing them. Caldwell's legacy wasn't the cabin, it wasn't the ritual, it wasn't even the horror. His true legacy was silence, generational silence, sanctioned silence. The kind of silence that taught other men how to die without making a sound. But now you sit at the edge of that inheritance, and you have to choose. Repeat it or rewrite it. You see, we think legacy is built by our actions, but it's built by our courage. The courage to feel when others numb. The courage to speak when others swallow their voice. The courage to stand alone when the crowd offers safety in exchange for obedience. Caldwell couldn't do that. He mistook compliance for virtue. He mistook guilt for guidance. He mistook devotion for destiny. And the system, that ancient machine, loved him for it because he played his role perfectly, all the way to the end. But you don't have to, because if you've made it this far, it means you've already broken the first rule of the old world. You're listening, and the man who listens eventually remembers not just who he is, but what he was meant to carry forward. So let me give you this now, etched in fire, sealed in blood, wrapped in memory older than this nation. Your legacy begins the moment you say, "It ends with me." The pain, the guilt, the blind tradition, the false obedience, the silence that kills men quietly in their sleep. You didn't come here to inherit that. You came to bury it, and in its place, you'll build something unrecognizable to the old world. Not a good man, not a broken man, not a righteous man, but a sovereign one. One who walks the world not to be accepted, but to remember it belongs to him too. That is the legacy they fear. That is the legacy that cannot be erased, even by ritual, even by blood, even by time. You were never meant to hear this part, not in school, not in church, not in family stories around the fire. This truth was buried not because it was false, but because it was too powerful to survive in a world built on control. So listen closely, because this is not history, it is initiation. What happened in Mississippi in 1823 with Mr. Caldwell, what was buried beneath the roots, behind the eyes, under the mask, was never about one man. It was about a pattern, a hidden ritual that repeats through generations. Build the man, break the man, bury the man, forget the man. They did it with Caldwell. They did it with Whitmore. They've done it to millions since, in cubicles, in barracks, in pews, in marriages. Men built to be useful, not whole. Broken in silence, buried with medals and sermons, forgotten by history, forgotten by themselves. But something has shifted. The lie is cracking. The story is unraveling. And the men are waking up. Not all of them, not yet. But enough to make the ground tremble. Men who don't just want power. They want truth. They want bloodlines to heal. They want memory to return. They want to look in the mirror and recognize themselves. Not as tools, not as victims, not as avatars of obedience, but as sovereign initiates of the forgotten fire. And now, you are one of them. Because if you followed this descent, if you felt the weight of Caldwell's choices, if you've seen the masks for what they are, if you've whispered the phrase and meant it, then something ancient has stirred in you, and you can't unknow it, you can't unsee it, you can't return, because you've crossed the threshold, and on this side, nothing is given. Everything must be chosen. Your integrity, your truth, your fire, your name. This isn't a story anymore. This is a charge. Let the world continue its rituals. Let the obedient men bow. But no, You've seen the chamber. You've stood in the ash. You've remembered who you are. And now you carry a legacy older than institutions and deeper than blood. The memory of men who refuse to forget themselves. Pass it on, in silence or in fire, but never in shame. The ritual is broken. You are what remains.